Thank you so much for the organizers to let me be here today, and I hope I will not encounter similar technical problems. I was so interested to hear what Paul would go on to say, because I do disagree with this inclusion of political ethnocentric Buddhism to engage Buddhism, and I would have loved to have a discussion with him about that. Today I will talk about something that is dear to my heart, that has to do with the intersection of Buddhism, queer theory, uh, and suicidology, critical suicidology. So, on the 23rd of June 2019, the 26-year-old Kyaw Zin Win, a gay librarian working at a university in Yangon, Myanmar, killed himself after having suffered prolonged homophobic bullying. His death started a conversation about the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, and questioning LGBTIQ+ people in the predominantly Buddhist country that has an alarmingly high suicide. Shortly after Kyaw Zin Win's death, Ashin Asaya, a senior Sayadaw Buddhist monk, was recorded performing what you only can describe as a 2-minute stand-up routine during a Dharma talk. In this stand-up routine, he not only mocked Kyaw Zin Win, but also called for all homosexuals to be shot in Duterte-style state-sanctioned killings, and or to be beaten to death by lynch mobs. The recording of a senior Buddhist monk's homophobic hate speech makes for chilling viewing and provides a necessary reminder of the plight of LGBTIQ+ people in majority Buddhist countries. Not only there, far from the Western rose-tinted Orientalist imaginary of the peaceful and inclusive Buddhist other, the reality and the lived experience of religion in Buddhist majority countries is far too often blighted by a vast array of hate-mongering, right-wing, nationalist, and militarist religious fanatics. Therefore, discussing vulnerable groups and suicidality from a Buddhist perspective cannot ignore the injustices and oppression supported and actively propagated by Buddhist leaders such as Ashin Asaya and his followers. There is an epidemic experience of social injustice among marginalized groups, resulting in sustained mental distress, suicidal ideations, and self-completed deaths. Already Emil Durkheim, in his examination of the social conditions of self-completed death, pointed to the fact that the act of taking one's own life cannot simply be reduced to individual pathology without social justice contexts. The messiness of our human experience and our, for the most part, bungling negotiation of individuation with the often contradictory societal scripts and value systems usually causes mental distress to everyone at some stage in one's life. And following on from mental distress, suicidal ideations are also common occurrences within the whole populace at some point in an individual's life. However, the frequency and the intensity of mental distress, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and self-completed deaths are statistically far more endemic with those marginalized populations who struggle with particular tensions and clashes with the dominant hegemonic societal scripts. These blueprints of social expectation and regulation function in Lakovian terms as the almost universal societal prototype. This prototype acts as an unobtainable and symbolic, yet inescapably powerful and oppressive ideal against which all members of society have to negotiate and perform their own individuations and identitarian expressions with an ethnocentric, racist, classist, body normative, neuronormative, sanist, ableist, and cis heterosexist patriarchy. As a consequence, large segments of the society find them to perform their social roles and their interpolated identities within a vicinity sufficiently close to the Lacoffian center, that center that creates abject margins, as to safeguard their stable mental well-being. The unjust social orders are inherently producing various and often intersecting degrees of abjection for a wide range of persons, according to skin color, racial and ethnic diversity, the poor and the working class, physical and or neural atypical persons, variously able persons, trans, intersex, lesbian, gay, bisexual and or queer persons, and on the whole to women who in patriarchal thought constitute the inferior human in relation to the male default. In fact, recently, the academic study of suicide, suicidology, has taken a social justice turn in the form of critical suicidology. If Buddhists can accept the predominance of social conditions for the concrete experience of suffering, the dukkha dukkhata, in mental distress and in suicidality, they will also reject the neoliberal late capitalist smokescreens that compartmentalize, individualize, and pathologize suffering in order to produce a firewall for maintaining inherent systemic injustices and structural violence. In the wake of the era of enlightenment, the scientification of social legal discourses in Europe and North America in the 19th century, around 1870, as Michel Foucault famously argues, led to the invention of the homosexual as an essentialized identity within Euro-American medical circles, equally as its counterpart, heterosexuality, emerged as an essentialized category. LGBTIQ plus people consistently show higher prevalence of mental distress and suicidality, not due to intrinsic psychiatric disorders, but rather due to social and societal stigma. Suicidality is particularly virulent among the younger under 25 LGBTIQ plus populace, and the extent of the problem is well documented in the case of trans people. A recent meta-analysis of trans mental health surveys from the global north demonstrates alarming statistics of various mental distress and suicidality indicators. Between 65 and 75% of trans-identified individuals report harassment and direct discrimination. Most trans people experience a daily onslaught of systemic and structural oppression, leading to a high prevalence of depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation, attempts, and completions. Research clearly shows that the trans populace is not, as sometimes still claimed in trans-hostile discourses, simply mentally ill. This trope is merely a contemporary incarnation of the early psychiatric invention of the suicidal homosexual as a pathologized stereotype in the sexological discourses of the 19th and 20th century. Rather, the research consensus points at societal stigma and marginalization as the key factors of worse mental health among LGBTIQ plus people. On the other hand, it is often claimed, rather simplistically, that religiosity is generally an inoculation against a certain degree, against suicidality. Although the evidence for this claim is weak and contradictory. Currently, research into this topic is in its infancy, lacking complexity, and for the most part, intersectional analysis. Without carefully considering the specific religious context, the usefulness of sociological studies claiming to address such far-reaching conceptual questions is highly doubtful. Unsurprisingly, hence, there is a clear indication that religion can function equally as either a risk factor or an inoculation for LGBTIQ plus individuals. In other words, it is complicated and context dependent. The effect of Buddhist forms of religiosity on suicidality is still insufficiently researched, despite the oft-repeated claim that practicing Buddhism protects against suicidal ideations and actions. Recently, researchers have started to develop a specifically Buddhist perspective on suicide prevention. For example, for Japan, a country with a significantly higher suicide rates compared to other countries with significant Mahayana Buddhist populations, it could be argued that for many Japanese, Buddhism, rather than being an immersed and lived practice, is merely a cultural traditional context, just as are Neo-Confucianism and Shintoism. And secondly, it cannot be denied that Buddhist-driven suicide prevention movements in Japan, with their successful mobilization of Buddhist priests and with media exposure, are having significant effects. The intersection queer and religion is highly problematic, both in religious and in queer activist discourses. While religions as vestigial forms of governmentality offer belonging in exchange for regulation, queer liberation has often dogmatically constructed the Western category of religion as an enemy of LGBTIQ plus expressions, identity performances, and rights. In this is I have called homosecularism. In this homosecularism, queer on the one hand and religious on the other hand are construed as antithetic and mutually exclusive. Any attempt to counter this homosecular impulse within the LGBTI plus rights advocacy is hampered by the abundant popular homo and transphobic rhetoric used within conservative Buddhist organizations and by Buddhist leaders in traditionally Buddhist countries in Asia, but also in the West. Within transnational modernist westernized Buddhist circles, the response to questions around sexual and gender diversity can namely also range from outright condemnation to well-meaning indifference or even to full embrace of the queer community. Just as is the case in contemporary Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu discourses, the anti-queer proof texting of pre-modern scriptures constitutes a key factor in contemporary Buddhist homo and transphobic LGBTIQ+ discrimination and stigmatization. During such proof texting exercises, influential conservative Buddhist leaders and thinkers conflate the complex and inherently alien categories of sex, gender, sexual behavior variants that is found in Buddhist canonical and commentarial literature with contemporary performances of queerness. Such proof texting in homiletic and doctrinal context is, at its best, hermeneutically insincere and misleading, and at worst, simply the dharma-splaining of one's own homophobia and transphobia. Buddhist anti-LGBTIQ+ discourses overlook the complexity of Buddhist traditions which have espoused multiple, often contradictory perspectives on transness and on queerness through time, diachronically, and in various cultural spheres, synchronically. It is necessary to highlight that the pre-modern Buddhist traditions did not essentialize sexual orientation as an identity as European discourses of the 19th century did. Further, modern global northern LGBTIQ plus categories only uncomfortably map onto pre-modern and indigenous Buddhist and Asian concepts regarding sex/gender and sexual behavior. It can be argued that at its most basic philosophical level, Buddhism regards sexual activities as actualizations of an attachment in the form of raga, sensuality, and as such counts among the core afflicting emotions that form obstacles to liberation and enlightenment. However, this does not render all of Buddhism's sex negative. Afflicting emotions such as desire, anger, and confusion are always also opportunities for the cultivation of right conduct and right mindfulness. For the ordained, the monastic code, the Vinaya, prominently prescribes celibacy. In early Buddhism, socio-legal prohibitions existed against any breach of celibacy for monastics, with varying consequences ranging from expulsion to degrees of repentances. The Vinaya also prevented the ancient South Asian third and fourth sex or /gender categories, so the categories apart from male and female, from the full participation and ordination in the monastic community. These abject categories were the Pandaka, which I translate as gender deficient, and the Ubatabhyanjanaka, the both-sexed person, often rendered in older literature hermaphrodite, which is a pejorative term for the intersex community and should not be used, most likely denoting an array of specific intersex conditions. Pandakas and Ubatabhyanjanakas were indeed barred from the Sangha in order to avert any social stigma associated with and corresponding to the prevalent discriminatory views in the contemporaneous South Asian society of views of non-normative sex, gender, and sexualities. However, these social, you could call them samsaric attitudes within early Buddhism are not necessarily reflective of the soteriological, you could say, nirvanic attitudes. In liberation and cessation, nibbana, there is not only the falling away of all defilements, such as desires, but there is also no sex/gender. The tension in Buddhist traditions between samsara, karmic, and bodhi, nirvanic orientations in Buddhist traditions is perfectly illustrated in the example of Buddhist attitudes towards gender equality, which espouses on the samsaric karmic level traditionally starkly patriarchal oppressive views on the unfavorable female birth. At the same time, early Buddhism accepted, even on a socio-pragmatic level, that sex/gender is not static. Even within one single lifetime, sex/gender can indeed change. Importantly, early Buddhist monastic regulations accept this fluidity and the change of sex/gender. These changing monastics are pragmatically confirmed by the Buddha and redirected to their new sex/gender community. Moreover, a past sex/gender change in itself was not seen as an ordination impediment. The Mula Savastivadi Vinaya even explicates that an ordination impediment only occurs after the third sex/gender change. On this basis alone, trans individuals should be safe from religious discrimination also on the organizational level in Buddhism. In terms of lay sexual ethics, the universal application of the liberatory Buddhist Dharma was not affected by the early socio-legal marginalizing regulations. Of course, early Buddhist sources frame the cultural specific Pandaka and Ubato Byanjanaka in terms of karmic obstacles to practicing the Buddhist path towards liberation and enlightenment. For example, Asanga's Abhidhamma Samuccaya denies layperson status to any Shanda or Pandaka, impotent or asexual and Pandaka. But there's also clear evidence of soteriological overriding of socio-biopolitical stigmatization of the third and fourth sex and genders. One such example can be found in the tradition of the Brahmajala Sutra, the Brahmanacha Sutra. This Mahayana discord formulates a universal bodhisattva ethics by explicitly affirming the enlightenment potential of all sexes and genders. The stigmatization of same-sex sexual activities developed in many Buddhist cultures only during and after the Kushana period of South Asian history. That means from the first 4 centuries, roughly from the 3rd, 4th century Common Era onwards. And I published about that before, so I won't go into details here. But it becomes clear that post-Kushana era Indic nuclear heteronormative procreative value productions around sexuality in the traditions of influential Buddhist compendia and their commentaries, such as the Yogacara Bhumishastra and the Abhidhamma textual traditions, spawned this sex-negative and queerphobic attitudes that took then hold and prevailed in Tibet and are meeting Neo-Confucian values in Chinese and Korean Buddhism. In Japanese Buddhist traditions developed conflicting attitudes towards same-sex relations, which included prominently the extolling of age-structured intra-gender relations between monks and novices, for instance, in medieval Tiandai and Shingon. From this background, it might not be surprising that a Japanese-derived transnational Buddhist movement, such as Soka Gakkai International, but also the US-American branch of the Nishi Hongonji, the Jodo Shinshu Pure Land tradition called the Buddhist Church of America, count among the most LGBTIQ plus inclusive contemporary forms of Buddhism. In the global north, some queer people have consciously embraced various forms of Buddhism and of Buddhist or post-Buddhist meditation practices as a means of addressing spiritual and psychological needs with various success. There is also an increase of inclusive voices and openly LGBTIQ plus teachers in multiple Buddhist modernist traditions. And far from being merely a project of global, transnational, and/or white or convert Buddhist modernism, queer inclusive voices and practices that have increasingly emerged within socially engaged, progressive, or humanistic Buddhism. Among contemporary Sinophone Buddhists, the Taiwanese Venerable Kyaw Wei features prominently in her unwavering support for LGBT community. In 2014, for instance, she performed the first Buddhist same-sex wedding ceremony in Taiwan. And in Thailand, an outspoken reformist Buddhist monk, Pradam, has developed a dedicated form of neo-Buddhism with a blogspot for queer practitioners, for networking and teaching. And in Japan, a Jodo Shu priest, Kodo Nishimura, who doubles as a makeup artist, has become the international queer face of Japanese Buddhism. So it can be argued that such example of vocal Buddhist queer inclusive voices and queer Buddhist visibility are crucial to suicide or self-death prevention among LGBTIQ plus Buddhists. Self-completed death and self-killing has been widely debated in Buddhist ethics. Traditionally, Buddhist views on self-completed death generally condemn ending one's own life as an action against the first 5 precepts, especially the first of the 5 precepts, non-harming, ahimsa. However, the canonical texts also report cases of those who had gained enlightenment or realization, arhats, taking their own lives. Further, corresponding to Durkheim's category of the virtuous altruistic suicide, the voluntary death or self-sacrifice of highly realized beings, such as bodhisattvas, for the benefit of others is found in Indic Buddhist texts. Such cases are usually narrated as a sign of accomplished detachment from the body and or as an ultimate act of dana, generosity, and karuna, compassion. In East Asia, a tradition of altruistic self-immolation emerged in reception of, among other scriptures, the 23rd chapter of the Saddhamma Pundarika Sutra, which corresponds to the 22nd chapter in the Sanskrit versions. This scriptural paradigm regained power in modern times as a form of social activist protest during the Vietnam War. It has further gathered traction since 2008 among Tibetan communities in the Chinese-controlled Tibetan regions and in exile. So, leaving aside the potential ambiguous ethical views on self-completed deaths, from the perspective of Buddhist liberation theology or liberation dharmology, the key to preventing any of the violent mental imprints and the wider suffering associated with self-killing is indeed changing societal and individual attitudes towards LGBTIQ+ people. And following on from Roger Corliss's queer dharmology and Jose Cabezon's Buddhist theology of sexuality, I propose rethinking Buddhist perspectives on LGBTIQ+ discrimination and suicidality by mindfully accepting the contextual limitations of scriptural and traditional prejudices, carefully rereading scriptural evidence, and in a manner of public dharmology, reapplying into contemporary context the liberatory impulses for inclusion and social justice. Those marginalized and suffering deserve deep and mindful acceptance and loving action by Buddhists to aid in alleviating both the individual pain and the systemic discrimination and suffering. The pivotal starting point of queer Buddhist liberation is to acknowledge the societal and structural dimensions of karma, action, and to reaffirm karma's relation to samyak drishti, to right view of no self, anatman, and more pronounced in Mahayana philosophy of the emptiness of inherent existence of all phenomena, including persons, the Pudgala Dharma Nairyatma. Where traditional and vernacular Buddhisms accommodate queerness, it is usually done without challenging the simplistic notion of bad karma. For instance, in Myanmar, while Ashin Asaya's homophobic and violence inciting reaction to the gay Burmese suicide might constitute the extreme of the spectrum, yet even the most open-minded traditional Burmese monks, Buddhist monks, permitting the Kaktina donations by organized, openly gay Burmese practitioners, practice their queer inclusivity with reference to notions of bad karma, which needs to be overcome. Bad karma that needs to be overcome. And queer inclusive Buddhist thinkers such as Venerable Kyaw Win and Prabhu Dham stress the importance of challenging deeply ingrained simplistic views on bad karma in relation to LGBTIQ+ subjectivities and belonging. And here I come to the title of my talk. Acknowledging the deadly force of societal stigmatization of LGBTI plus people, Venerable Kyaw Wei quotes the popular Chinese saying, "I did not kill Boren, but Boren is dead because of me." This saying is indeed a quote from the biography of Zhao Yi in the 69th volume of the Book of Jin, where he, alias Boren, was murdered by his cousin while his friend stood by and did nothing. The saying in this context, as used by Venerable Kyaw Wei, points to the, in Buddhist terms, karmic responsibility of those who do not stop the killings. The LGBTIQ plus self-deaths due to systemic societal oppression. Indeed, simplistic karma bashing constitutes the core of Buddhist anti-LGBTIQ plus dharma-splaining, spiritual bypassing, and spiritual harming. Despite the complex tenets of no self and emptiness, past actions that led to phenomena and experiences today, colloquially denoted as past karma, often become in popular simplistic Buddhist discourse judgmentally essentialized, for instance, as gay or disabled and so on. These experiences are then frozen upon an individual without any regard for the deeper philosophical understanding that the manifestation of any jati, of any birth, and any rebecoming in Buddhism is necessarily an expression of continuity without identity. Continuity without identity. The empirical person or subject in their current and fluid manifestations simply express karmic continuations of past possibilities and are personally neither accountable nor blamable, nor to be morally judged for past lives. Any human manifestation needs to be examined as a precious opportunity for subject contextual merit rather than regarding every person as duly limited and blueprinted by prescripted societal expectations. Societal scripts present in Buddhist societies and traditions are accessories and contexts of the Dharma. They are not the Dharma itself. This is also true in the case of the patriarchal nuclear law heteronorm that we see here, which formulates the concrete and normative expectation on Buddhist lay people to establish male-dominated, gender-binary, heterosexual, procreative, reproductive relationships and hierarchical clan family structures, compulsory cisgender heterosexuality, and procreative monogamous marriages, relationships. Here, queer theory is helpful. It is helpful for excavating and challenging harmful societal scripts around sex, gender, and sexuality normativities and beyond. Judith Butler's notion of performativity is particularly receptive for Buddhist philosophical readings. Both Butler's queer theory and Buddhist philosophies insist on a non-essentialized view on human identity and stress the context-dependent, ever-changing nature of human experiences and their negotiations of relationships. In Buddhist terms, we might rephrase this as a condition-dependent, ever-changing nature of samsaric experiences and their inter- or codependent arisings. Where these scripts cause, contribute, and or lead to suffering and lead to self-completed deaths, the act of suicide cannot conveniently be located in the individual, at least not exclusively. Stigmatization and marginalization feature as decisive factors in the contextual nexus of decision-making and agency. So it is my radically engaged Buddhist view that all those who do not proactively work for social justice share in the karmic consequences of the suffering that social injustice brings. The various Buddhist karma theories stress the immaterial and the ethical dimensions of actions as opposed to material and merely ritualistic transactional aspects. Hence, karma in Buddhism is fully ethicized, and there is a continuous need to re-ethicize karma for social justice. It means to challenge popular karma discourses and vernacular Buddhisms on aspects of reductionist individual determinism and the lack of complexity and actor intention focus. Such challenges to prevalent determinist and reductionist notions around the relationship between cause and effect, in philosophical terms the karma-phala sambandha, stand in the long tradition in philosophical discussions of Buddhist karma. The popular notion of any linearity and personal ownership of karma has been rejected early on from the Milinda Panya onwards. One of the most famous philosophical refutations of this notion is found in Nagarjuna's Munamatyaga Karikas. It is good to be reminded that karma, in its causal aspect, is defined as cetana, as intention. For instance, in the Nibedika Sutta, in the Deep Penetration of Wisdom Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, where it simply states, Citanaham bhikkhave kamam vadami. Monks, I state that karma is intention. In fact, Buddhist karma is intention dependent, so to such a degree that accidental or even ignorant actions cause no or very little offense, as the Milinda Panya says, and or that non-intentional karma does not cause grave negative results, as the Satyasiddhi Shastra by Harivarma says. On the other hand, cetana as karma means also that those who plan, preach, and practice, let's say, think, say, and do, exclusion, even if they do so in the name of ill-understood dharma, co-produce and share in the dukkha dukkata, in the karma of the LGBTIQ plus experience of concrete suffering. It is therefore an ethical imperative for Buddhists to actively co-create inclusive societal parameters and to oppose those societal scripts that cause discrimination and systemic suffering. And this can easily happen within the wider frameworks of early sutric lay Buddhist sexual ethics, with a focus on equality of power balance, non-coercion, and the respect for existing commitments among adult partners, rather than relying on later added interpretation that merely conform to prevalent societal prejudice in Kushana and post-Kushana South Asian Buddhism. Equally, the right view on the inherent emptiness of phenomena, their interdependence, and the processuality and fluidity should allow a truly non-judgmental acceptance of gender performances, expressions, subjectivities, and belongings beyond the dominant male-female binary, particularly in view of the Buddha's own pragmatic reaction to sex-changing monastics. Trans Buddhists can utilize the powerful paradigms of sexless gender-changing realized beings to recognize both the inherent emptiness of gender categories and to accept the occurrence of physical mental gender incongruence or fluidity as simply one of the experiences that occur naturally in samsara. I have suggested that dharmology, queer dharmology, or rather any socially engaged Buddhist liberation praxis might operate from a fivefold parameter. First, reflexivity and positionality. Second, engaged hermeneutics for the oppressed. Third, reconceptualization of Buddhist thought. Fourth, signification, resignification of paradigms for liberation and marginalization, and fifth, application of liberatory practices. So Buddhist care for queer lives need to start from a position of reflection of privilege and intent. That's the first. Standing by while our friends complete the murder committed through structural oppression is not an option. Therefore, we need to start to queer, to challenge the harmful karma reductionism that abounds in popular and vernacular Buddhist contexts. We need to do so hermeneutically, on the second level, and conceptually, on the third level, so that the discourse that provides a dharmic justification for the self-completed murder ceases. Instead of justifying the individual honors of marginalization, stigmatization, mental distress, and suicidal ideation caused by systemic oppression, we need to excavate queer Buddhist paradigms and role models and provide and support queer visibility of openly LGBTIQ plus Buddhist teachers, leaders, and practitioners. That's the fourth point. So that includes spaces and that inclusive spaces and practices can emerge. That's the application, the fifth. And that is evidenced in the work of communities of Venerable Kyaw Wei, Pravar Dam, Lama Rod Owens, and an increasing numbers of other influential Buddhist voices. And with that, I want to finish. Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions for you that comes from pop up from your very interesting speech, and one is more, let's say, theoretical, philosophical, and the other one is more to do with the practical side of Buddhism. It has to do with how to bring these thoughts, these insights into the daily practice. So the first question is that from a philosophical point of view, we could say that Buddhism supports standpoints which are close to the contemporary concept of post-human. And in other words, maybe we can say that the Buddhist worldview, in the Buddhist their view, there isn't anything like an immortal soul. So we might say that Buddhism doesn't have an essentialist approach to human being. So the question is, human beings are not this way or that way due to their essence. And would you please elaborate more this concept, this idea of non-essence in Buddhism?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. I mentioned that in my talk a little bit. Basically, our experiences on a samsaric level are simply the ever-changing constellations of the heaps of graspings. So in a very simplistic point of view, we could say all we are these heaps of disturbing emotions. There is no essence, there's no soul, there's no self. However, there is a sense of personhood as a sort of a construct. And because we reduce our experience always to a manageable amount, we mistake these reductions of our experience for a sense of self. So instead of saying, well, the ever-changing heaps of grasping that manifest now as happy, now as sad, and so on, we say I. And with the problem of I, we attach certain forms of attributes. Now, attributions, qualities, and activities that we identify with. Now, ultimately, this is to be relaxed, and this is to be overcome. However, these identity markers or subjectivity markers appear very, very frozen in our subjectivities, and this is where we go wrong. And it's a huge work to liberate ourselves, liberate from that. But as long as we have these, what we call ignorance, avidya, or stupidity, these forms of stupidity, to think that we are and have a self, we have frozen forms, attributes of subjectivities. And what is interesting about this idea of male and female, but is also interesting about the idea of sexualities, these kind of aspects of subjectivity occur to us in our deluded state as very, very stiff, as very, very essentialist. So much that, for instance, the Buddha, in the context of the different forms of samadhi, declared the female-male binary as one of the five nimittas, one of the three nimittas, characteristics that only fall away on the higher levels of the jhanas, of the trances. So there is a pragmatic acknowledgement that in the reality of Buddhist, of human experience, we construct a personhood, while on the absolute level, this is basically an illusion. And that there is only always the ever-floating, ever-changing appearances interdependently arising, playing around and ceasing. So on the consequence of social reality, we cannot use soteriology. Somebody who suffers, yeah, if you have somebody who suffers, comes to you, well, I want some consolation, I suffer, and then you say, well, from a point of wisdom, there is no subject to your suffering because, there's no self, no soul. So what's the problem? Yeah. So that is inherently unkind. That is using wisdom where you need to use compassion. And that is exactly the point. So in my personal opinion is, with all these kind of socially engaged, progressive, of liberatory actions, is that we use always compassion for others and always wisdom for ourselves. So we try not to take ourselves so serious, but we cannot actually tell other people, well, don't take yourself so serious, because at the end of the day, there's only the 5 heaps of skandhas. Yeah, that doesn't take away the suffering.
Exactly. I completely agree. And these last words coming from you brings me exactly to the second question that has to do with local communities and Buddhist centers around Europe and the world. And some of the local communities are sometimes faced up with this form of abuse, of discrimination, without being really aware that they are involved in them, and without having the tools to cope with the suffering that this kind of behavior involves individuals. So in your opinion, how is it possible to act in these cases, and what good practices can be put in place? Since Buddhism and engaged Buddhism are a form of practice created in order to transform suffering into human flourishing, which good practices we can really put in place when we have to face this kind of discrimination and violence?
Yes, thank you. So I would say we need to start with the basis. What kind of ethics do we want to promote? And, most people understand Buddhist ethics as a form of virtue ethics or consequentialist ethics. So in other words, we ask for which virtue is behind what we are doing, or what consequences have our actions, right? So, and here, if we simply remember that the basic, whether it's Theravada Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism or Vajrayana, the basic ethical principle is be kind, Then we start getting interested in the concrete suffering of other groups, even if we don't belong to it. And then need to be disabled to understand that there is a lot of suffering among the community of people living with disabilities. I don't need to be LGBTIQ plus to understand that there is a huge amount of daily suffering going on, or racism, and so on. So we inform ourselves, and we simply keep our dharma-splaining, our wisdom for ourselves, and acknowledge that concrete suffering is there, and then we just try our best to learn what is needed. Now, what is needed is inclusive languages, is inclusive practices, is inclusive simply openness as a human. You know, very often you have in outside Asia also you have a phenomena of people, conservative, even alt-right people who are practicing a secularized or individualized form of Buddhism. And they defend their own privilege by saying, oh, Buddhism is just quietist. We don't do politics. People should just shut up. If you're a woman and you feel discriminated, well, meditate more. If you're gay, meditate more. If you're trans, meditate more. If you're disabled, well, yeah, that's your condition now. Just meditate. Yeah. And they don't understand that they are part of the problem, that they are creating the systems that can lead to suicidal ideation and to self-deaths, you know? So we need to reflect on what the impact our usage and abuses of the Dharma has. And if that's so simple as putting a safe space sticker on the door, or supporting LGBTIQ pride or progressive legislation, or respecting how people want to be called with their pronouns, how they want to be seen and their gender identity, making Sangha groups accessible for people with hearing difficulties, with seeing difficulties, or also with neurodiversities. Yeah. Having breakout rooms for neurodiverse people, for autistic people, where they, and all these, there are so many guidelines of best practices. You just need to inform yourself and trying, as part of being kind, yeah, as a Buddhist, as part of being kind, to be welcoming and inclusive.
Thank you so much. Since you are so kind and your speech is so interesting, I would like to ask you one more last question. And during all your speech, and also during the speech of Professor Fure before you, you talk about discrimination, nationalism, ethnocentrism, climate crisis, and other political and social emergencies. And they are often linked to the problem of hate speech. Yes. And how, the problem of how we use the language, how it creates separation, fanatism. Also, the way we think about karma and nationalism can have a real deep consequences on our society. So, do you think that what we call engaged Buddhism can really contribute to build an alternative relational and social model, starting exactly maybe from the language and from this kind of new way of seeing at Buddhism?
Yes, I think we need to be clear that our way of thinking, saying, and doing are often ways of othering. And othering, separating a subject from the environment, from the totality, is a core fundamental Buddhist mistake of ignorance, of stupidity. The moment we say I versus you, we versus they, we are far away from liberation and enlightenment than we were before, right? So just to stop ourselves. At the other hand, othering is also neurocognitively seems to be pre-impulsed. Yeah, it's almost like an impulse, yeah, to do. And so we have to stop ourselves and be aware always where we other. and where we are seduced to feel good about ourselves or ego by putting somebody in a different box and putting them down. Yeah? So I think that is really at the heart of Paul would say unwholesome, engaged Buddhism. Don't think that is engaged Buddhism. I think it's political Buddhism. Political Buddhism also not just ethnocentric Buddhism, yeah, not just nationalist Buddhism, but there's also political Buddhism, for instance, here in the West, that is anti-LGBT, anti-inclusion, yeah, and this kind of political Buddhism comes from this impulse of suffering. So I think for ourselves, if we look at just on ourselves, use this wisdom for ourselves and think about, where do I suffer? Where do I make these kind of ego mistakes? And always use what a non-friend of mine called self-distancing. Yeah, self-distancing. The moment I catch myself being egoic and other, you do self-distance. You reflect on anatman, on no self, and you shut up and listen. So if we try to practice that is a good that is a very good approach, I feel. Thank you.
Professor Scherer, there's a question coming from the people who are following our conference today. If I may, I would like to ask you one more really last question, if it's possible, right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So the question is, Buddhism is ethnicized, and karma in Buddhism is ethnicized, and there is a constant need to re-ethnicize karma in order to have social justice. Any other consideration on that in relation to the misunderstanding of the meaning of karma in the contemporary society is possible?
Yeah, so what I said is ethicize, so it's ethical.
Ethicize, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Ethics.
Okay, I didn't hear you correct. Yeah, it's ethical, it's ethicized. Yeah.
Yes.
What this means with that? Well, there's a typology in South Asian karma theory where you look at it as a transactional model, and you ask yourself, is karma that is something mechanical? That's the case in Vedic understandings of karma, right? Or is there an ethical component? With the Upanishads, there comes an ethical component. In other words, it's not just what I do mechanically, like a physical law, but there's also a component of intention with it. Now, this intention has then to do with the transaction, right? Karma is an action, it's a transaction, right? So you have an actor, and that you have an act, and then is that what is being done, action. So there's a transaction going on. So what do we emphasize in Buddhism? We emphasize the actor, the intention. And that means the intention is so important in Buddhism, at least at the action component, that action causal component, that the virtue or the ethics behind it is the most important thing. So then that means we have always, as Buddhists, when we intentionally think, say things, and do things, we will always have to ask what the intention, what the virtues are behind what we speak. There's some brilliant rules all over the internet already in memes, for instance, when you should speak and when you shouldn't speak. You should ask, is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it timely? And so always being reflective, always being meta-reflective. Yeah. So even if you think, if your reductionist understanding of any form of Buddhist Dharma is like that you feel the need to judge other people and to condemn their actions, you can still take a step back and think, well, is that actually the kind thing to say and do? right? So look at the consequences. And that is it more, this going away from an idea of karma as mechanistic. You have that in Jaina karma, yeah? In Jainism, you have that mechanistic. That's the focus is on the action, not on the actor. There is not an ethical component with that. It's mixed in contemporary forms of Hinduism. It's fully ethicized in Buddhism. So when we act, we need always to ask ourselves, what is the underlying intention now? Is it to self-aggrandize, to make myself feel better by putting somebody else down, by make myself feel better by pontificating about the true nature of the Dharma or whatever? What kind of cui bono, what kind of power, what kind of narcissistic reward will I get by saying or doing something? Or is it really altruistic? Is it really helpful? Is it really in a way that somebody can accept it, in a way that it's constructive? So that's a very good practice,